Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our webinar on benchmarking soil health for production environments. We're very excited that you are able to join us. We're going to be discussing the proposed framework for voluntary standards for the state of New York, which we'll explain in some greater detail just shortly. So on the next slide, just a quick introduction of the three of us, the speakers. My name is Harold Van Ness, and I am a professor of soil science at Cornell University and have been leading an effort in soil health for about 25 years. I also do work on precision nitrogen management using kind of data-driven approaches, and not the focus of our discussion today. Joseph Amsili is a member of our team, and he focuses more on, you might say, vegetative interventions, things like cover cropping, rotations, etc., and does a lot of work in terms of carbon dynamics in soils. He's also our point person on data analytics, and most of the results that you'll be seeing today will be basically based on his work, and he'll be presenting it. Debbie Aller is a member of our team who focuses more on bioresource management, and also is our lead person as it relates to soil health in urban systems and perennial fruit system. But as a team, we kind of integrate quite a lot and work together. A little bit on the logistics for this webinar. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A feature. Webinars have that feature as opposed to a regular Zoom meeting. Because it's a webinar, the ability for participants to speak has been disabled. Also, we're not using the chat feature in terms of interactions among participants, but it is activated for you to communicate directly with the three of us as hosts. And so that if you have any particular problems, then you can use the chat feature. But please put your questions in the Q&A feature. As we go along, the members of the team will be answering some of those questions. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll also dive a little bit more into very specific questions. So I hope that all makes sense. So next slide, Joseph. So the context of this webinar is the New York State Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act. This was legislation that was passed a couple of years ago by the New York State Legislature and signed by Governor Kathy Hochul. I think it's very innovative legislation. It basically focuses on enhancing soil health programs in our state. And to promote the adoption of soil health practices by land managers in the state. There's one aspect of the legislation that is the focus of today's webinar, and that is that the state asked us, that is the Cornell University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, to establish appropriate voluntary standards and objectives for soil health. And that's a quote from the legislation. So the objectives of this meeting is to review and explain the work that we did on the newly developed soil health benchmarks, and to solicit public comments. And we've set up a web page where you can enter your comments, your concerns, your suggestions, etc. And Debbie will come back to that later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about voluntary standards, benchmarks, and goals, and what they mean. So voluntary standards in this case, in our view, relates to relevant metrics to aspire to achieve and encourage improved soil health. So it's really more of an aspirational approach. That could be compared to, say, more strict standards that exist for, say, water quality and air quality. Many of you are probably familiar with them. That can be used for regulatory programs to enforce quality levels. That's not the focus of our discussion today. We want to focus on these voluntary standards. Doesn't mean that our framework on benchmarking could at some point in time be used, for example, to address concerns about restoration of construction sites or things like that. But that's a discussion for another day. We're going to be focusing on these voluntary standards, which require benchmarks. So these benchmarks basically are ways to compare a measured value from a field or a plot somewhere in New York or elsewhere, and reference that with some kind of a standard, and to associate those with a goal. So next, let me go a little bit into what the benchmarking then entails. So the primary goals that are associated with this effort is to improve ecosystem services outcomes as they are provided by healthy soils. That's the overall goal. That's, of course, the goal of the legislation as well, because there's a societal interest in healthy soils in terms of food production, in terms of the environment, in terms of climate, etc. Also to help target policy efforts by decision makers and government people, to help land managers calibrate their soil's health, and to then help them achieve better soil health outcomes. That's obviously, one of the primary objectives. So regarding the metrics, they should be such that they can be readily adopted and used by practitioners, and that they address relevant processes and functions of the soil. Then regarding the benchmarks, we approach it in the context of being able to facilitate the establishment of achievable goals. And then they should be realistic in terms of soil health outcomes, so that they are achievable. And they should account for natural and human factors that influence soil health outcomes, like soil, climate, land use, etc. And Joseph will go into further detail on those aspects. And also, it's important to point out that the framework is designed in such a way that it can be updated with new information. As we get more data on soil health, then we can make adjustments to these benchmarks to fine-tune them. So in the next slide, I wanted to discuss the comprehensive assessment of soil health, which forms to some extent the background of this approach and the learnings that we've achieved from that. So almost 20 years ago now, in 2006, we launched the Cornell Soil Health Laboratory in an effort to measure soil health and to have meaningful indicators of soil health. And in that regard, we recognize that we need to look at physical, biological, and chemical processes, but also that we needed to use indicators that are readily measured, that are practical, because measuring processes themselves is typically prohibitively expensive. We established a way to interpret measured values, identify soil constraints, and provide guidance for management. So over all these years, we've made some minor adjustments to the framework, but we now have the benefit of 30,000 plus samples that have been processed through our laboratory. And so these data then provide us opportunities to do the appropriate analytics to develop these benchmarks. So just to highlight a little bit what's on the right, which is the first page of a standard soil health report that a person would receive if they submit a sample. You see 4 physical indicators, you see 4 biological indicators, and then you see 8 plus chemical indicators. So the physical indicators relate mostly to things like water retention, compaction, erosion and runoff potential, etc. The biological indicators relate to the total organic matter and carbon and nitrogen, but also fractions of the organic matter that relate to protein and active carbon or permanganate oxidizable carbon, which we now know mostly relates to sort of plant-related carbon materials like phenolic and polyphenolic compounds. And then it measures respiration. which is a microbial activity indicator. The chemical indicators are the standard chemical soil test and nutrient and pH test that has been used over many years. So you see in the columns towards the right, we see measured values, and then you see an interpretation of those values, which we call rating, and that's on a scale from 1 to 100. And then we used some color coding to indicate where there's potential concerns. At the bottom, you see an overall quality score, in this case, which is 46 or medium. But an important component of this cache approach is to identify specific problems, specific constraints. Like in this case, aggregate stability is a low value. And then we can link that with management guidance, which I won't go into today. So on the next slide, then, I just want to highlight the relationship between these indicators, which are readily measured metrics for soil health and at relatively low cost, and how they relate to various soil processes, so physical, biological, and chemical soil processes. I'm not going to go into detail on this. We've discussed it in prior webinars, but the main point that's important to make is that the framework attempts to be comprehensive in that it sort of addresses all the relevant processes and functions. So whether it's related to food production, environment, or climate in the soil, so that the assessment is indeed comprehensive. So at this point in time, I'm going to hand it over to Joseph, who will talk more about the data that we have analyzed and are the basis for the benchmarking process.
All right, thank you, Harold. We can think of three major factors of soil health that really shape these soil health outcomes and really need to be the basis of our soil health interpretation. So the first factor is inherent, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. These parent material, soil type, climate, biology, slope, time, soil forming factors that wherever you want to landscape shape those inherent properties, whether that's texture, drainage. And those are things we have no control over, but are really essential for interpreting soil health, as we'll show. And then for the second one, we have this cropping system factor. So land use also shapes soil health outcomes, our research has shown. And we have limited control over this one because some of these carbon and nutrient cycling and balance regimes of these different cropping systems are, in a sense, structural. So we don't the outcomes for an annual grain farm would never approach those necessarily for a pasture farm. So this really helps us to understand outcomes within these different cropping systems. And we're using this term production environment a lot in this new framework, production environment soil health benchmarks. And production environments combine these inherent soil properties like texture with land use to create production environment peer groups. So an example might be loam textured soils, annual grain cropping systems in Western New York. And that would be a production environment that you could compare your soil health results to your peers. And then finally, we have management, which within each of those cropping systems, farmers have the ultimate control to shape their soil health in terms of crop rotation choices, cover crop choices, organic amendment choices, fertility choices, crop yield. All those things influence soil health. So we know that there's some farms in New York State that don't use any cover crops and are using a lot of intensive tillage versus some that have been doing no-till and cover cropping for a long time. So first, let's think about those inherent factors of soil health. The soil type is one, soil texture is a huge one, and also climate plays a big role. You can see that Long Island is really kind of classified as a very different climate zone than most of the rest of New York State. It has more of this maritime, warmer climate down here. So soil biological indicators by soil texture. As soil scientists, we've known for a while that finer textured soils with more fine silt and clay are just naturally able to store more organic matter and organic carbon than coarser textured soils. And the same was true for some of these newer soil health indicators like active carbon and respiration. So this is really important. If our goal is to assess the effects of management on soil health, we need to know this inherent information. So a 4% organic matter might be average for a silt loam soil, but for a coarse textured soil, that would be really, really a good indication that you're far and above the average for what that soil type normally has in terms of organic matter and organic carbon. In some of our analyses and our database, characterizing our database, one of the first things that popped out was one of this regional impact on soil health. And when we think, we've split it up by regions, but I really want you to think of the climate influences here. So as I showed you before, Long Island has a more maritime, warmer climate, humid climate. And we found in our analysis that across soil type, the same soil texture and the same cropping system, this is comparing pastures from Long Island with pastures from the rest of the New York State, that Long Island pastures and other cropping systems just regularly had lower organic matter concentrations on average than the same soil texture and cropping system from the rest of the state. And the explanation is likely that the coarser textured soils on Long Island and the slightly warmer climate are the likely causes of these differences. So if we want to assess the effects of management on soil health, understanding these soil type and these climate influences are really, really critical. We've also been contributing at the national level to another data interpretation tool called SHAPE that I just want to mention here. If you're from a different state within the United States or maybe from Europe, this tool could be applied potentially in your situation. So if you want to interpret soil health values across the United States, it's clear that you need more than just soil texture information. So this tool uses soil texture, soil taxonomy or soil type, and then mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation to interpret soil indicator values. In this example, we're looking at a Midwest mollisol or grassland soil from Iowa. And this framework tells us that a soil organic carbon concentration of 2% gets a score of about 46 and is a pretty medium value. Let's compare that with a different soil from a different climate. So we have our example from that Midwest Iowa soil. We can also compare that to a more arid soil from Texas, much warmer climate, much drier. And that same 2% soil organic carbon in this new environment has a very high score of 90%. So this tool is a very powerful tool that enables you to assess soil health with a lot of very important, some of the most important inherent drivers of this information: soil texture, soil type, temperature, and precipitation. And theoretically, this approach, this powerful approach, could be used to develop benchmarks for New York State. But one of the important things, it does not account for land use. So we feel that land use is a really critical thing to make realistic benchmarks that are appropriate for different types of cropping systems that we'll talk about in a bit. And this tool is available online, and that's all I'll say there. So now on to factors of soil health, the effects of cropping system, and also management in terms of biomass cycling. So our work has found that cropping systems and management also play a huge role in shaping soil health outcomes. And we can use this example to really to show why that's so important. So we can think of two extremes related to agricultural specialization and how those two extremes have very different carbon and nutrient cycling imbalances within those systems. So on the left side, you can think of natural or pasture systems where all of that photosynthesis and biomass that's produced on site, all those shoots and roots are recycled in place, and we don't have any disturbance from tillage. And then we can think of our most intensive systems, our annual grain or processing vegetable systems, where potentially 50 to 70% of the carbon and nutrients are harvested off the field in terms of crop export. 30 to 50 might be returned. And we also can have some other losses, carbon losses, in terms of tillage and loss of our best topsoil through erosion, leading to a less happy earthworm. And in some of our conventional systems, nutrients are replaced with synthetic fertilizer, but that organic matter and carbon that's lost through crop export and these losses from tillage and erosion don't tend to be replaced, which leads to soil degradation, as you all are familiar with. So early on, about 5 years ago, when 5 or 6 years ago now, when I joined this position, we started to really use the database to ask this more novel question. How do cropping systems, our management, New York has a great diversity of cropping systems across the landscape, impact soil health? And we looked at 6 different cropping systems. We most recently added orchards, but so we had annual grain systems, rotations with corn, soybeans, and wheat, dairy cropping rotations with corn silage and alfalfa, pasture systems, orchard systems, and then we had 2 vegetable categories, which was really important, more smaller scale, diversified vegetable operations and rotations that were maybe kind of more direct to consumer, CSA farms, organic farms, that type of class, and then also larger scale processing vegetable farms, farms that are growing crops over a larger scale acreage, like cabbage, snap beans, pumpkins, sweet corn, etc. So we looked at the effect of those different cropping systems on soil health. And our results showed that pastures and mixed vegetable systems tend to maintain the highest levels of soil organic matter. One note with this is we're using that inherent context, so we're only comparing the cropping systems for loam textures here because we know that we want to compare apples to apples. So pastures and mixed vegetables had the highest levels of soil organic matter. Dairy cropping intermediate has very intensive parts of the rotation with corn silage, where more than 90% of the biomass is removed from the field, but also has perennial forages and lots of manure inputs. And then our most intensively used systems, annual grain and processing vegetable, on average tended to have the lowest soil organic matter levels. When we looked at aggregate stability, we found that across soil type, undisturbed pastures by and far had 2 to 3 times higher aggregate stability than our other annual cropping systems. And this really reinforces what we know about continuous living root systems, their associated mycorrhizal fungi for building and maintaining aggregation. Also, we found that mixed vegetables, due to their higher organic matter cycling and biomass inputs and organic matter concentrations, had higher aggregate stability than processing vegetables. So even if there's a bit of tillage in the system, having higher organic matter levels will improve the structural stability of your soil. And we use this, people that do these kinds of demonstrations for the public and farming community take advantage of this, and we often compare aggregates under a pasture and aggregates under conventional or annual grain system, something that's been conventionally tilled, to show this soil slaking demonstration so they can see the results of this in real time. And you may have seen some of the results from what I was talking about, characterizing soil health by soil type and cropping system in some of our summary reports that we've released. We released a statewide report in 2020, and then our first regional characterization report for Long Island, where we're really focused on Long Island and characterizing the status of soil health on Long Island farms. So this was really important in terms of documenting current status of soil health, and also shares this distinct production environment approach. So Harold discussed this in great detail, but this is just, now we're going to be moving into our framework for establishing these voluntary soil health standards. And as Harold mentioned, these benchmarks can be really useful for helping farmers calibrate their management. They can help target policy efforts, but according to our research, they really need to be adapted to regions, soil types, and different production systems, so they can be as useful and realistic to the farming community. So here's an example of our framework, these production environment soil health benchmarks. And here's an example for annual grain systems on loam soils in upstate New York. And this is what that distribution of samples looks like. So we're developing these soil health benchmarks by soil type, cropping system, and region. And that's called a production environment when all those factors are grouped together. And this approach, like the SHAPE approach, is based on a probabilistic approach. In statistics, in the statistical sciences, we sometimes call this a fuzzy logic approach. And this is the same way that folks in the medical field use to interpret blood pressure, for example, by age or height, for example. So we've proposed the 90th percentile for these state voluntary benchmarks, but additional percentiles can be extracted. So this is a whole distribution, and a lot of information can be used. For the voluntary standards, we're just proposing 90th, but here's an example of some other benchmarks that could be pulled. Potentially the 25th percentile is a high concern benchmark. That would be 3% for this production environment. 50% or less than 50% below average might be of concern. 75th is a good indication that you're doing a good job with your management. And 90th percentile we could call an aspirational outcome. So let's look at this again. For the legislation's purposes, for developing these voluntary soil health standards, we are proposing the 90th percentile for these state benchmarks. So here's an example where I've put both annual grain and pasture systems on loam soils in upstate New York. This voluntary soil health benchmark for annual grain would be 3.7% organic matter, but for a pasture would look like 5.2% organic matter. And this basically establishes clear pathways and realistic soil health targets depending on which cropping system and soil type and where you farm. So for example, let's say you have a soil test value from a field that comes back at 2.5% organic matter, and you're on loam textured soils and annual grain system. There's clear evidence that with different management, you could potentially be climbing to this higher aspirational benchmark, because your peers in the same farming system, same soil type, have been able to achieve those goals as well. So these benchmarks exist for each production environment by texture, cropping system, and region. So we have these values up on the website. This is basically for each indicator and soil texture, cropping system, and region. We have what these 90th percentile benchmark values are, just to show what that is. And we also feel like it's really important to have a universal benchmark. It's good to have one realistic benchmark depending on your farming system, but it's also useful information to see how you compare with a pasture system, which probably represents the best possible soil outcome for a given soil type and region. and thus can really act as this universal or aspirational upper benchmark for all cropping systems to compare to. How healthy could my specific soil be under this really good continuous grassland management? So we also have some information for that. So potentially benchmarking in the future could look like getting your cropping system specific benchmark, and then also looking at the pasture benchmark to see, okay, that pasture goal might not, pasture benchmark is not a realistic for me as an annual grain farmer, but it's useful for me to know where that is in terms of understanding where I'm at. And now I'm going to hand it over to Debbie.
Thank you, Joe. So I want to share that this work has been peer-reviewed, all the work that Joe just mentioned, and published last year in the journal Geoderma Regional. The manuscript presents the data in a lot greater depth than Joe has shared in the webinar today, and the scientific justification for how we developed all of these benchmarks. It is open access, so anyone can find it online, and we've also made the PDF available on the New York Soil Health website and as you registered for this webinar. Next, please. So if you're not familiar with our policy brief series, we had also wrote up this work as our latest winter 2024 policy brief. And these are short 2-page documents that are designed to distill our research findings from a technical level into a more easily understandable or digestible form, but provide evidence-based information and considerations for policymakers, other stakeholders to consider with this type of work. So they're really brief, meant to be applicable or digestible for a wide audience and to assist them in making more informed decisions to advance soil health initiatives. Next. So where are we in the current process around establishing appropriate voluntary standards and objectives for soil health in New York State? This is where we are in the process. We've completed the first 3 check marks, as you can see, the data analytics, research, publishing peer-reviewed literature, which I just shared with you all, presenting to stakeholder groups. We've met with farmers, we've met with various agencies and organizations to share this work, and now it's open for public review. So what's highlighted there or bolded in red is the step we are at in the development of these voluntary standards. And we've already received some really good comments and feedback from farmers and other researchers and stakeholders in this area, including it's important to have targets, but we need to make sure that these are benchmarks and they don't become mandatory, that these remain voluntary standards. We've also received some comments in terms of what happens as our database increases and we receive more samples. How are the distribution curves that Joseph shared a few slides ago? How are we going to guarantee that these won't change, right? And so Harold mentioned in the introduction that we've received thousands and thousands of samples over more than 10 years. So we have a good level of confidence in our database across these thousands of samples that the distribution really won't change to affect these benchmarks. So our next steps moving forward are going to be receiving public comments, hopefully from many of you on the webinar today. There's a deadline of March 31st. We're going to present this work to New York State decision makers and other state agencies. And then hopefully within the next year or two, we'll publish these final benchmarks. Next. So hopefully everyone has seen this link, but the public comment period is open until the end of the month, so March 31st. There's a link to the form, and it's a very straightforward form. Your name, email address, organization, profession are all optional entries. But the comment there, which says, please provide comments on these PESH benchmark concepts, our concept and science as a foundation to establish appropriate voluntary standards in response to the New York State legislation. Next slide, please. So to make it easier for you all, we've provided a QR code directly here to a link for that Google form online. And I noticed someone just said, could you put a link to that? We can also provide a link in the chat, but please, if you want to snap this with your phone right now, that's probably your easiest way to the Google form. And thank you for listening and attending the webinar today. And we'd like to open it up for any questions and a discussion. So I'll invite Harold and Joe to come back on. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom to enter any questions you might have. You're able to upvote them if you really are supporting what someone else has said. And now we'll open that.
Great, thank you, Debbie. I've left some of the most recent questions explicitly in the Q&A box so that we can discuss some of them because some of them are worthy of a little bit of discussion. I'm going to take the first one from Jeff Pistrak or Pistrak. I'd love to see benchmarks and protocols for agroforestry systems, including alley cropping and silvopasture, any work planned on that. I would say it's sort of a next level consideration for us. We do rely on samples being analyzed through the lab so that we have a distribution of values that we can use. We do try to plug some of the gaps that we have in our database. For example, Debbie did a very deliberate effort working with our extension field staff in perennial fruit systems because we didn't have a very strong set of data from soil health analyses on perennial fruit systems. So we've kind of filled that gap, and we're also looking at urban systems, et cetera. So agroforestry would kind of fall into that category where we may want to put some effort into it. It's important to point out that with this approach, which is a kind of a statistical approach, that you need to define the distribution of soil health outcomes. So ideally, you would have cases where you have some high values and some low values so that you can define that distribution. So that does require a considerable number of samples to be analyzed, and so that does require some effort, and that relates also to a question that I already answered. That was looking at pasture systems, whether they were rotational grazing or other. We currently don't. Our database isn't sufficiently large and nuanced to be able to identify differences, but we do know that we do have a distribution of pasture value. So if the pasture management is done very well, like say maybe through an excellent rotational grazing system, that would be reflected in the soil health outcomes, and they would be, say, in the 75th or 80th or 90th percentile of the distribution. And the pastures that would be poorly managed would be at the lower end of the distribution. So it's sort of inherent in the way we approach the system.
Thanks, Harold. I think that partially answered the next question from Sebastian as well, about doesn't having separate benchmarks essentially removed improved rotation and cropping system as a BMP recommendation. I think your response partially answered that one as well. I don't know if would you like to expand on that one further?
No,
too?
yeah, I think that's that's a point. It's important to recognize that that the land use and the cropping systems are sort of what we decide upon, and within that you look at the management. So whether it's improved rotational grazing, that's a management practice. That's what falls onto the curve. So it is sort of inherent in the way we approach that. So if a management practice or a rotational system is being improved within the context of, say, general, cash grain production, like corn, soybean, wheat, or processing vegetable production, if there is improvements within those systems, then that would be addressed through these benchmarks and scoring functions. Now, when you start to look at hybrid systems, if you say combine, growing processing vegetables with maybe rotating land with a dairy farmer who then applies manure and maybe puts it into alfalfa grass for 3 years, that's an area where you might say, well, that's how you improve a processing vegetable system. And so you kind of have to think about what's your primary production system, and then how you fall into the different categories that we have.
And just to
Okay.
add one thing, though, the importance of having that universal aspirational pasture benchmark is so that you can look at your peer group and compare to your peers, but you can also look at this aspirational, what's under pasture. So hopefully people would look at both, and the most innovative farmers might find that they're able to achieve their aspirational voluntary standard, and they want to look at a higher goal potentially.
Yep, great point there, Joe. So the next two questions and comments kind of around the policy side of these voluntary standards, and as it relates to the CLCPA, and some of the recommendations from there. I think one of our next steps after some of our public comments is to meet directly with political officials and other state agencies and talk about this benchmarking work. And so I think the political implications or policy side of it is down the line. I think one of the most important things that we've heard and we mentioned here today is really making sure that we're keeping these standards voluntary and really not making them mandatory. But at some point that may be out of our control. I don't know if Harold or Joe have any further comments to those kind of policy related questions.
No, I think it's an important point. We're currently focusing on delivering on what the state of New York asked us to do in terms of these voluntary standards. And so, but I agree that there's definitely a policy decision that could be could be entertained, but within the context of having these benchmarks, and that sort of relates also to the question, why did we, from Augustine Oliva, why did we pick the 90th percentile? We picked that because we think it's a good aspirational goal. It doesn't mean necessarily that in all cases it has to be the 90th percentile. That's a discussion that we can have, and there may be cases where a different benchmark, but based on the same distribution data, may be appropriate. For example, I could imagine that a soil restoration project after a major construction effort, maybe like a pipeline installation or a solar farm installation or something like that, that you wouldn't be looking for the 90th percentile, but you could maybe look at the 50th percentile. You just basically want the soil to be restored to an average value. So that's a discussion that we would be happy to have with agency people who oversee those kind of activities. So we're not necessarily locked into the 90th percentile for all applications, but we do think that in terms of inspiring land managers to move towards an aspirational goal, that the 90th percentile would sort of be the most obvious one. But that's also part of the process of why we want some public comment. So please put that into the public comment. If, maybe many people say, 90th percentile is maybe not the appropriate one. And that wouldn't be a problem from our perspective, because we have the distribution functions, and whether we ended up, using the 90th percentile for some cases, or the 75th in another case, or the 50th, maybe for a third situation, as I just described, that's really something that can be done within this framework.
So I think the next two questions, if Joe, you want to take them about hayland management and technical service advisors.
Yeah, Brian, that's a great question. I guess there's two different types of hayland. There's, I guess, the kind of the forage hayland in a dairy cropping system, and then a hayland perennial grasses that's harvested for hay. And I think the hay ground is also included in that pasture group, is probably theoretically is the lower end of that distribution. But this late summer and fall, I'm going to be starting a pilot pasture soil health project where I really want to look at that question of comparing adjacent pastures using rotational grazing, etc., with long-term continuous hay ground where the hay has been harvested, so we can have a greater insight into that important nuance of pastures versus hay grounds. Both represent undisturbed systems, but obviously there's some important differences there. And the next question, I'm curious how a farmer could use the benchmarking information to make decisions. Do you think technical assistance is needed to help farmers improve management? And is training for service providers on your to-do list? Yes, this is definitely a lot of farmers are too busy, so they have agricultural professionals help with the technical assistance of taking soil samples and helping them interpret results. So this definitely fits into that framework. We're working on basically not adding to what you might get back with that soil health report. So maybe a page 2 would be having this PESH benchmark information as well, of how you compare to your production environment, folks farming on the same soil and the same cropping system, and also compared to pastures on that soil type, so you can have that information for service providers to walk through with the farmer as they're doing their AEM plan, or they're doing making their management plan based on soils data. So it definitely fits into that, and we're working on having these graphics and benchmarking figures be made routine so that they're easy for folks to access, so they can use them for this information. And then, yeah, I think some training will need to be done in terms of so the professionals understand where these numbers come from, et cetera, and how they can be used.
So I'll probably take the next question there from Bruce. Which cropping system do vineyards fall within? So right now, from a statewide perspective, we don't have enough of a database for vineyards specifically. They'd probably be lumped in considered or have maybe similar indicators as orchards right now, but hopefully as our database increases, and I'm working with a lot of colleagues across the state and trying to gather more soil health samples for perennial fruit systems. So I think moving forward, we'll hopefully have a cropping system category that's perennial fruit systems that includes orchards and vineyards and small fruit as well, if they are perennial. So that will evolve, and we are really increasing our database of samples in this area right now.
There was one question that sort of fell off about training. It was an anonymous person, but just want to maybe reiterate that we're doing the training is very much part of what we do. If you go to our website, you will see newyorksoilhealth.org. You'll see a lot of training materials, like our soil health guide. I would also suggest the book Building Soils for Better Crops, which I co-authored with Fred Magdoff which is a great self-study resource. And then we about once a year, we do a major webinar training. We did it just a few months ago, and that's a 7-week effort. So we'll be sending out announcements for that as well, if anyone is interested. And I noticed there was a note from Elizabeth Henderson about the connection with the organic farmers. We've always said it's maybe good to do a shout out to the Organic Farmers Day. They always had soil health on their minds, and so many of them have been, very good collaborators in these type of efforts.
There was also a question about how to collect a soil sample and the timing around that. I did provide a link to a video for how to collect a soil health sample in that response, and when may vary. Most people, it's either the spring or the fall, really depending on management activities and cropping system and soil moisture levels. So there's some various considerations for that, but typically either spring or fall, and really being consistent with, if you first start collecting in the spring, in future years, when you're collecting a soil health sample, you would collect in the spring. You wouldn't be switching seasons.
Right.
Joseph or Harold wants, oh, go ahead.
Can I just, Liz Henderson also mentioned that a farmer co-op could use their soil health scores to help advertise their food. Maybe Joseph, you want to maybe address that, because we've actually invested a lot of effort in terms of helping farmers, basically do exactly that.
Yeah, we've really enjoyed working on that, and we actually did a case study with Zaid from Norwich Meadows Farm in Norwich, New York, where we invested a lot of time to develop this really beautiful one-pager that is designed for the more kind of consumer-facing farms that interact with the consumer, whether they use this at a farmer's market stand or on their website to basically be marketing their soil health practices and outcomes, which the public is getting growingly interested in carbon and the efforts of farmers and the work of farmers to be addressing this at the farm scale. So we've been, really developing this nice one-pager, and we'll have some more information to share on that soon.
We just put that one-pager in the chat function. Joe, do you also want to take the next question from Brian there?
Yeah, it really depends on the system. It depends where your starting place is. But as we know, soils change slowly. So it's hard to know whether an exact length of time, but yeah, in terms of the different types of management practices, you could start to think about what that might look like, and that benchmark is always kind of a really useful to continue to calibrate our management and to understand whether our management practices are having the intended outcome of actually increasing organic matter or soil health indicator and helping us get to those benchmarks. So the benchmarks are really the tool to know if our management practices are enough to get to that benchmark. So I wasn't really able to answer that, because the length definitely depends on where you're starting from, what system you are, the management practices, which all kind of control how much biomass is returned to the soil and the degree of disturbance. So hard to quite pin that down, but the benchmark really gives us that tool, because tracking things through time is really difficult in terms of soil health indicators.
I would add to that we often use the analogy with human health, and think of it as your blood pressure being high. You'd like to be 120 over 80, but you're at 180 over 120, and so how long does it take you to bring that down? Well, that depends in part on how aggressively you're addressing the issue. But you know that your goal would be 120/80, and that you would want to get there either through your diet, your exercise, or other ways, or medication. So that's that analogy would be very apt in this case as well.
The next question, whoops, just moved, is about or Vermont is attempting to design a program for payment for ecosystem services. Is there something similar or something happening in New York? I will say yes. Actually, C.C. Tompkins County has really been leading a pilot program effort around developing a payment for ecosystem services program for New York farmers. Jenna Durario and Graham Savio, who I believe are both on this webinar today, are really leading that effort there. And so, and there are many other people who are working in areas related to PES, and also developing some methodology for that as well. So it's certainly an area of work in New York as well. And I realize we're nearing the end of our 1 o'clock to 1 o'clock in our 1 hour. Are there any other, Harold, would you like to address any kind of final questions there?
No, I think we maybe want to honor the time. So please, if you have any specific comments, again, use our website. We're asking for some background information on who you are, so that we can get back in touch with you. But it's not required. If you want to provide comments anonymously, that's fine as well. And we really would like to hear those comments. We really this is a you might say a world first effort to provide benchmarks for soil health at this level of detail. And so we really, it's very important for the state of New York, but it may become globally relevant. So we'd like to sort of really understand if people have concerns or are there weaknesses in our approach. How could we possibly improve it, given the constraints that we have? So please feel free to provide us with those comments. And with that, maybe it is 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in New York. So thank you all for attending. I noticed that there were participants from nearby and faraway places. And so we appreciate the discussion that we had. And I hope that you learned a lot, and that you like the general approach that we are taking towards soil health benchmarking. Wish you a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.